The little girl stood still at the checkout counter. Her old sneakers barely touched the dirty floor. Her blonde hair was messy and tangled around her face. Her jacket was way too big, 3 sizes too large. It looked like it was swallowing her small body. In her shaking hands, she held one loaf of bread against her chest like it was made of gold. Her bottom lip shook as she stared at the cashier's screen. She watched the numbers that she didn't fully understand, but she knew they meant trouble. Behind her, the line was getting longer. A woman with a shopping cart full of groceries looked at her phone, annoyed. A businessman in a nice suit moved from foot to foot. Right behind the little girl stood 3 huge men that made other customers step back. They were bikers dressed in black leather and denim. Their vests had patches and club symbols on them. Their boots were heavy on the floor. The cashier was an older woman named Ruth. She had worked at this register for 20 years. Ruth watched the little girl count coins with shaking fingers. Pennies, nickels, a few dimes. The girl's voice was very quiet and cracked as she spoke the words that would change everything. My mom can't afford bread. The store seemed to hold its breath. Ruth's hand stopped over the register. The impatient customers suddenly found something interesting to look at on their phones. And the 3 bikers, men who looked like they could tear apart a car with their bare hands, looked at each other in a way that said a lot without words. The little girl's name was Emma Hartley, and she was 7 years old. She lived with her mother Sarah in a rundown motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where rooms were rented by the week and dreams died slowly. Room 14 had become their whole world. A double bed they shared, a microwave that only worked sometimes, a mini fridge that hummed too loudly, and a bathroom with tiles that had given up trying to stay white. Sarah Hartley had once been a dental hygienist with a steady paycheck, a small house, and plans for Emma's future. But life has a way of destroying security very quickly and cruelly. First came the divorce from Emma's father. He disappeared with another woman and left them with nothing but debt. Then Sarah's mother, Emma's grandmother, got very sick. Sarah quit her job to take care of her all day and all night. They used up all their savings in just a few months. When her mother finally died, Sarah had no job, no money, and couldn't pay the rent. The eviction notice came on Emma's 6th birthday. They'd been living in the motel for 8 months now. Sarah worked 2 jobs, early mornings cleaning office buildings and late nights putting items on shelves at a warehouse. But the money she made barely paid for the weekly motel fee. Food became a luxury they had to carefully plan for. Emma had learned not to ask for things. She'd learned that her mother's tired eyes meant another bill had arrived. The sound of her mother crying softly in the bathroom meant they might not have electricity for the microwave that week. But Emma never complained. She was wise beyond her years in the way that children who are forced to grow up too quickly often are. She noticed everything. Her mother skipping meals while making sure Emma ate. The way her mother's jeans hung looser each week. The darkness under her eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. On this Tuesday morning, Sarah had given Emma her last $5 and sent her to the grocery store 3 blocks away. Just bread, baby, she'd said, her voice tight with exhaustion. Just the cheapest loaf you can find. Emma had nodded seriously, tucking the $5 bill into her jacket pocket like it was a treasure map. Inside the grocery store, Emma had gone straight to the bread aisle. She'd looked at the prices carefully. Her finger traced under the numbers as she counted in her head. The cheapest loaf was $3.49. That should leave enough for something else, maybe eggs. But at the register when Ruth scanned the bread, the total came to $3.72 with tax. Emma's heart sank. She pulled out the $5 bill. Her face fell as she did the math. That left only $1.28 back. Not enough for eggs, barely enough for anything. That'll be $3.72, sweetheart, Ruth said gently. Emma's fingers trembled as she counted out exact change. But then she looked at the nearly empty basket area, thinking of her mother's thin face, and the words tumbled out before she could stop them. My mom can't afford bread. It wasn't quite true. They could afford this loaf, barely. But the bigger truth behind those words hung in the air like smoke. They couldn't afford bread and anything else. They couldn't afford to live like this. Ruth's eyes filled with tears right away. She'd seen struggling families before, but something about this tiny girl with her too big jacket and her careful counting broke through the professional wall Ruth usually kept up. The 3 bikers behind Emma had been quiet until that moment. They'd noticed the little girl when they'd walked in. mostly because she looked so small and determined. They'd ended up in line behind her by chance. They were coming back from a charity poker run for the local children's hospital. Their leather vests had the easy-to-see patches of the Hells Angels, a motorcycle club with a reputation everyone knew about. Rough, scary, the kind of men people whispered about and avoided. The biggest of the three was a man called Bear. He got that nickname many years ago, and it fit him perfectly. He stood 6 feet 5 inches tall, weighed close to 300 pounds of muscle, and had a beard that would make Vikings jealous. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of a hard life. Military service, lost brothers, battles fought on streets, and inside himself. Around his neck hung a small silver cross that you could barely see against his black shirt. Beside Bear stood Ghost, a thin man with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind. And the third was Hammer. He was younger than the other two, but no less scary, with scarred knuckles and eyes that had seen things he wished he could forget. When Emma whispered those 5 words, Bear felt something inside his chest crack open. He'd been that kid once. Different situation, different time, but the same deep poverty that made a loaf of bread feel like an impossible luxury. He remembered his own mother crying over an empty pantry. He remembered the shame of free lunch tickets at school. He remembered the constant hunger that became so normal you almost stopped noticing it. If you believe in the power of watching carefully, in trusting your instincts, and in the courage it takes to speak up when something feels wrong, then pause for a moment. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, because this story will remind you that heroes come in all sizes, and sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Bear looked at Ghost, who gave the slightest nod. Hammer's jaw was already set with determination. Bear stepped forward. His huge body cast a shadow over Emma, who looked up with wide, frightened eyes. But Bear's voice, when it came, was surprisingly gentle. "How much she need?" he asked Ruth, not Emma, as if understanding that the little girl had already been through enough. Ruth looked at Emma, then at Bear. "The bread is $3.72. She's got it covered, but that ain't what I asked." Bear's voice was firm but not harsh. "How much to fill a cart for her family? Real food? The kind a kid should be eating." Ruth blinked, caught off guard. I don't know. Maybe $150, $200 for a good supply." Bear pulled out his wallet, worn leather held together more by habit than anything else, and placed $200 in bills on the counter. "Ring up whatever she needs. If there's extra, she can come back for more later." He looked down at Emma, whose eyes had gone impossibly wide. "You got a mama waiting for you at home?" Emma nodded, too shocked to speak. "She working herself to death, trying to keep you fed?" Another nod, this one with tears that finally spilled over. Bear's face softened in a way that changed his whole appearance. "Then let's make sure she don't have to worry about it for a while. You go pick out some real food, kid. Eggs, milk, meat, vegetables, whatever you need. We'll wait right here." Ghost stepped forward and handed Emma a shopping basket. "Go on, little one. Get the good stuff." Emma looked at Ruth, who was openly crying now, then back at the 3 huge bikers who somehow didn't seem scary anymore. Really, Hammer confirmed. "But hurry up. We got places to be." Emma moved through the aisles like someone in a dream, carefully choosing items she and her mother hadn't been able to afford in months. Fresh apples, a carton of eggs, real butter, chicken breast, a gallon of milk, cheese, pasta, sauce. She was crying the entire time, barely able to see through her tears, but she kept going, filling the basket until her arms hurt. When she returned to the register, Ruth helped her unload everything. The total came to $187.34. Bear nodded with satisfaction, but before Emma could leave, Bear bent down to her level. "What's your mama's name, kid?" "Sarah," Emma whispered. "Sarah Hartley. And where you living?" "The motel. The one with the blue sign. Room 14. Bear stood back up, his face unreadable. He looked at Ghost and Hammer again, and something passed between them that needed no words. "You get that food home safe," Bear told Emma. "And you tell your mama that she's doing a really good job raising you. Sometimes good people hit hard times. There's no shame in that." Emma nodded, holding the bags that Ruth had carefully packed for her. "Thank you," she managed, her voice breaking. "Thank you so much." "No thanks needed, little one. Just pay it forward someday when you can." Emma walked out of that grocery store carrying bags that felt like they held more than food. They held hope, proof that kindness existed, evidence that the world hadn't completely given up on her and her mother. The three bikers watched her go, then turned to Ruth. "You got a manager here?" What happened next would become a local legend. Bear, Ghost, and Hammer walked into the manager's office. The manager, a middle-aged man named Dale, looked up with alarm as three members of the Hells Angels filled his doorway. "We need to talk about the families in this neighborhood," Bear said without waiting. "The ones who can't afford groceries. You know who they are." Dale swallowed hard. "Some of them, yeah. We see regulars who count pennies. Kids who come in trying to make food stamps stretch." "What?" "Because we're going to do something about it," Ghost said tonight. What they suggested was bold. The bikers wanted to buy a lot of the store's inventory, food, toiletries, cleaning supplies, basics that struggling families needed, and give it to the neighborhood's most vulnerable residents. "How much we talking?" Dale asked. "How much you got?" Bear replied. By noon, word had spread through the Hells Angels chapter. By 2 o'clock, more than 20 bikers had arrived at the grocery store. Their motorcycles lined the parking lot like a gathering storm. By 4 o'clock, they'd raised over $15,000. They moved through that store like a force of nature, filling cart after cart with essentials. Other shoppers stopped and stared, amazed. The bikers weren't taking anything. They were buying everything. Entire shelves of canned goods disappeared into their carts. Fresh produce, meats, bread, pasta, rice, beans, baby formula, diapers, soap, shampoo. If a family needed it, it went into a cart. Dale had never seen anything like it. His staff scrambled to keep up with the purchases. By 7 o'clock that evening, as the sun began to set, 20 motorcycles left the grocery store parking lot, loaded down with bags and boxes. They rode in formation through the neighborhood, engines rumbling like thunder. They stopped first at the motel with the blue sign. Sarah Hartley had been pacing room 14 for hours, worry eating through her already frayed nerves. Emma should have been back long ago. The thoughts got darker until she heard the knock on the door. She yanked it open and froze. Emma stood there, barely visible behind the mountain of grocery bags she'd somehow carried. Behind her, 3 impossibly large men in leather vests waited on the motel walkway. Their faces were gentle despite their scary appearance. "Mama," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion. "These men helped us." Sarah's hands flew to her mouth. She looked from her daughter to the bikers to the bags of groceries. Her mind was struggling to understand what she was seeing. Bear stepped forward. "Ma'am, your daughter told us you were having a hard time. We've all been there. This isn't charity. This is community." Sarah started to cry. Big, heaving sobs that she'd been holding back for months. Emma set down the bags and wrapped her arms around her mother's waist. Both of them were crying together in the doorway. But the bikers weren't done. Over the next hour, they gave food to every family in that motel who needed it. And there were many, single mothers like Sarah, elderly people on fixed incomes, veterans struggling with injuries and trauma. The bikers knocked on doors, asked simple questions, listened to stories, and left boxes of supplies without judgment or expectation. They did the same at the apartment complex down the street. By midnight, they'd reached more than 40 families, leaving behind not just food, but something more valuable, the knowledge that they weren't alone, that someone cared. In room 14, Sarah and Emma sat on their bed, surrounded by groceries, still crying, still unable to fully understand what had happened. Among the bags was a simple note written in rough handwriting. For Sarah and Emma. "Hard times don't last forever. Keep fighting. You're not alone." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. If this story has touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. We bring you stories that prove heroism comes in all forms, that courage isn't measured by size or age, and that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important messages. Tell us in the comments, have you ever noticed something important that others missed? Your story might inspire someone else. The impact of that night rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. The grocery store manager, Dale, started a special fund for families in need. Ruth, the cashier, started a food drive at her church. Other businesses in the neighborhood began looking for ways to support struggling residents. Sarah found new strength in knowing that people cared. Within 2 weeks, she'd found a better-paying job with regular hours. Within a month, she and Emma had moved into a small apartment. Nothing fancy, but it had a real kitchen and a bedroom for Emma and windows that let in actual sunlight. But more than the physical improvements, something deep had shifted inside both of them. They'd learned that pride sometimes needs to be swallowed, that asking for help isn't weakness, that the world contains more good than the news would have you believe. Emma grew up carrying that lesson. She volunteered at food banks throughout high school. She studied social work in college. She became the kind of person who noticed when others were struggling, who spoke up when someone needed help, who believed in the power of small acts to create big changes. And the Hells Angels, they never publicized what they'd done. No social media posts, no press releases, no expectation of recognition. They did it because they remembered being hungry, being scared, being on the edge of giving up. They did it because they knew that sometimes the people who look the scariest have the biggest hearts. Years later, when Emma was 25 and working as a social worker herself, she'd tell the story of that day in the grocery store to the family she helped. She'd explain how 5 words, "My mom can't afford bread," had changed everything, how being vulnerable had opened the door to grace, how the world's toughest-looking angels sometimes wore leather instead of wings, and she'd always end the story the same way. Never be ashamed of needing help, and never underestimate the power of speaking up. You never know who's listening. Sometimes salvation arrives on motorcycles. Thank you for watching. If this story reminded you to trust your instincts, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to never underestimate the power of paying attention, please share it. Subscribe for more stories that prove heroes are everywhere. Courage comes in all forms, and sometimes the smallest person in the room has the biggest impact. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in Emma's place? Bear, Ghost, and Hammer rode away from that neighborhood that night with lighter wallets and fuller hearts. The rumble of their engines faded into the darkness, leaving behind a community forever changed by the reminder that humanity at its core is still capable of deep goodness. That sometimes the hardest exteriors protect the softest hearts. That angels come in unexpected forms. And that 5 words whispered by a 7-year-old girl can start a revolution of kindness that echoes through generations. Because in the end, it's never really about the bread. It's about remembering we're all human. It's about seeing each other, truly seeing each other, and choosing to care. And it's about knowing that even in our darkest moments when we feel most alone, somewhere out there is a stranger who might just become our salvation if we're brave enough to ask for help. Emma never forgot that lesson, and neither should we.